Look at the Chicago cityscape. We're going to look at buildings, at public spaces, for that matter, even at kiosks and vending machines on the streets of Chicago, to ask what is being done to our city. In the main, is it being rendered more attractive, more livable, more human and humane, or otherwise? In my view, the answer is otherwise, with significant exceptions. My three guests are, to begin with, an old friend, Blair Kamin, who writes about architecture for the Chicago Tribune, won the Pulitzer Prize for that writing back, I think, in 1999. And his book of last year has just now been reissued in paperback. It is titled Why Architecture Matters, and it's published by the University of Chicago Press. Our other two guests are both eminent architects in town. Larry Booth, who's the founder of his own firm, Booth Hanson Associates, and has done many important buildings in Chicago. Dan Coffey is the founder and the design principal for the firm that bears his name, Daniel P. Coffey and Associates Limited. Before we go any further, Blair, tell our listeners a little bit more about the careers and the achievements of our two other guests.
Well, they are, as you said, eminent architects. Larry was a member of the Chicago Seven, a group of architects that revolted against the sterility of steel and glass boxes back in the 1970s. And
they're equivalent to the Samurai Seven, but in architecture.
Yeah. He's done some terrific award-winning buildings, like the renovation of Old St. Patrick's Church, which won a national AIA Honor Award. And Dan has done some tremendous things for the city as well. He led the renovation of the Chicago Theater, the new Sears store on State Street, which is very successful, and more recently the new Bloomingdale store in the old Medina Temple. So both of these people have really improved the cityscape in a lot of ways, both not only with their buildings but also with their words.
Their words. All right, let's sample some of those words. What is, would you say, Larry Booth, the most acceptable, the most aesthetically pleasing or even exciting structure to rise in Chicago over the last year?
Well, I look at the Millennium Park project as kind of about a great, something Chicagoans can be very proud of, and a very risk-taking project. It's not something that is out of a formula. It was very kind of creative in a sense of bringing a lot of things together that had never been put together. Landscape architecture, Frank Gehry's bandshell. There's going to be a fountain by this Spanish artist, and then some preservation of the old colonnades at the north end.
And all of that pleases you. Now I'm going to turn to our colleague Dan Coffey in a moment. While you think about what has happened in the last year that most displeases you. And I'll be asking you that shortly. But, Dan Coffey, what has come up on the skyline that you have found most satisfying over the last year or thereabouts?
Well, I think one that I really like quite a bit is the Skybridge project along the expressway in Halsted Street.
You can see it from Greektown.
Yes, it's very exciting for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not part of the formula that we see in all the dozens and dozens of other high-rise housing that's being built right now. It actually has a real presence on the skyline, a real presence in the streetscape. It's a nice mix of uses. Yeah. It's really an exciting project.
And actually, Blair has done a very enthusiastic article about it only recently.
Yes, it's a...
Describe it for those who may not have seen it yet.
Well, if you think of instead of being the monolithic tombstone of concrete like most of the other new towers are
on the State Street corridor and so on.
Yeah, this building is really conceived of as two towers. Think of a tuning fork with a giant trellis of steel on top of it, and you get an idea of what this building looks like. I call it a Swiss cheese skyscraper because part of the excitement of this building is that it has voids, holes right in the middle of the building. Between the two parts of the tuning fork, there are these glass bridges running across, and you can see the sky right in the middle of the building.
That sounds like it could be fascinating, but it could be done badly. Actually, the proportions are very pleasing.
They're beautiful, and the thing about this building is that it's composed with an idea of not just renting apartments, the private profit of the developer, but rather making a contribution to the public realm, the cityscape that we all look at. And that's what really makes it exceptional.
But it also stepped across a few bounds in that it's very, very rare in an apartment building or a condo building that you actually have the ability on the upper floors when you're in the lobbies or the corridors to look out and see something. And here, the bridge, the name where it came from, there are bridges that link essentially two buildings together, and from that bridge, while you're walking to your condo or to your neighbor or whatever, you're going to be seeing the whole skyline of the city as well as
Actually,
the west.
Blair said in his recent article about the building that it's so dramatic a place with such dramatic views that inevitably they're going to film the next James Bond movie.
I can see Halle Berry running across one of those bridges. I mean, it's a sexy building, and it deserves to have Halle Berry in it, I think. Absolutely.
I think the client developers need to get a lot of praise for this too, because they went well beyond the formula, which is simply building a big concrete box.
Right.
And they looked for ways and supported the architect in ways that allowed them to break the large size of the building down into, as Blair said, some components.
Okay, so we looked at some of the good stuff. Now then, back to Larry Booth. What made you weep or rage when you saw it or first read about it?
Well, I'll avoid Soldier Field for the moment, but I think what's happened in the just off Michigan Avenue on the Ohio Street corridor and the Michigan or the State Street, and those large collections of slabs of large boxes of concrete.
It's rather like the old
really
State Street.
It's
like the old State Street projects further south.
Well, I've described it as East Berlin, as kind of it's kind of the attack of modernism. What is it? The modernism returns, revisited.
Revenge of
the modernists.
Is it the return of misused Miesian?
Reloaded modernism.
Well, is it in fact modernism in the Miesian sense?
No, it's modernism in the trickle-down, cut rate, low rent. Well, not low rent; it's high rent. But this is modernism. This is the kind of stuff that gave modernism a bad name. And these are just buildings that are totally put up with a profit motive in mind.
And they just stand there, slab after slab, darkening each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's fascinating about these buildings is not only the way they look individually, but the way they're placed. I mean, I was at the corner of Dearborn and Ontario today, and there were like three of these, really big things cramming in, and so. That's not Chicago. That's Manhattan. And I mean, if I want that, I can go to the Upper East Side.
It is the canyonization of Chicago.
Sure.
And that's something we've always avoided.
Right.
One of the very key parts of it is that the real strength of Chicago as an urban place is the quality of both the foreground buildings, which are the landmarks, and the tremendous quality of the background buildings. And here we are having dozens of essentially background buildings that are horrible.
I fully agree with you. I think it's ugly, it's horrible, and it really, in many ways, stigmatizes the city. And I don't know who to blame. You probably do. Who is to blame? What process is to blame? What people are to blame?
You can certainly blame the architects. I think the zoning, overzoning, making it possible to build buildings that outstrip the architect's talent, if you want to look at it that way. They were just too big. And they're in the street. No matter what they look like, they're just too big.
Let me raise the Roman question. Cui bono? Is there big money being made by this kind of architectural cheating? Or this kind of architectural transgression?
Hopefully for the developer's sake, I hope that they do well, but I don't think they are. I don't think people are going to respond. I think they're going to lose because they're just.
I think that
they're not attractive.
Are there some particular developers who are associated with this terrible turn that things have taken in Chicago?
I think, the Magellan Company is one
I've
that's
seen
put
that
up
name
a
on
lot of
billboards.
these. Yep, they're a developer that's put up several of these projects west of Michigan Avenue.
Is the Renaissance aunt of John Buck involved as well?
John Buck is not involved in any of these high-rise condos, but he has inflicted, obviously, some of his own
He has
damage.
indeed.
Milt, there's other damage, too. I mean, we've talked about the high-rise condos, but even in the Loop, you can see some damage going on. I mean, one of my least favorite projects of late is the Bank One Corporate Center, right at the corner of Dearborn and Adams. This is a very glassy blue building right across from Kitty Corner from the Federal Center of Mies van der Rohe. And it's this huge, very crudely hulkily, chunkily proportioned building. It kind of looks like a, it's got this big curving front. It kind of looks like a double-bellied sumo wrestler about to, muscle its way onto that beautiful plaza.
That's a strong figure. Who designed it?
It's designed by Ricardo Bofill, a Spanish architect who already has inflicted his brand of modern classicism on us at 77 West Wacker, a building that has stacked temples of columns. They look pasted onto this silver glass facade. I kind of call it the paste-on Parthenon.
Oh yes, of course. Is that the Leo Burnett building?
It's next to the Leo Burnett building. It's often called 77 Wacker. It's called the Donnelly.
It's 4 or 5 Greek temples piled on top.
Yeah, well, many more than that. Yeah, exactly. I figure with Bofill, it's 2 strikes and he should be out. I don't know if we should let him back.
Well, his primary client is no longer building in Chicago, so he's probably not going to be back.
Now, Dan Coffey, I haven't yet given you occasion to tell us what you hate most that's happened in the last year or so.
I have the sort of disadvantage of having all of my primary ones taken already, so that's a little difficult. I think actually the ones I'm most upset by are the little bus stops that are all around town.
So am I, and we were arguing about that just before we went on the air.
I think that J.C. Decaux does a lot of very rich-looking facilities in other cities, and these somehow they just don't look that rich.
Well, for one thing, I'm offended by the illuminated ads that one sees on the interior, but also you see them from the exterior of those bus shelters or whatever they are technically called. And I think it's a blight on the feel of a sophisticated urban residential area, as for example Lakeshore Drive, the inner drive, where they are slotted at just about every corner. Why do we have to do that? And again, I would ask, who profits? And what does Mayor Daley have to do, and the filling of his political coffers have to do with all of that?
I don't know anything about that, but I would argue that as I've noticed them, I think certainly in some places, because in some ways they're ubiquitous, but in some settings they're quite pleasant, and they do offer the transit rider shelter and a place to sit down, and when you see people using them, it's quite reasonable.
Oh, well, I don't mind having benches where people waiting for a bus can sit down.
Their function and usability there is quite excellent, but they just look and seem more like they should be at Disney World than here in Chicago.
Which reminds me of yet another complaint. I'm full of complaints when it comes to what they do to this city.
Geez, I don't know. The architects have enough trouble getting something built.
Well, I want to
add to the...
I want to raise another question, which is not about buildings, in fact, but about something else. Blair knows that I'm always in a curmudgeonly mood when we have this discussion. But I wonder, are there other cities, European or American, that have so many vending machines on the average corner, usually for publications, either free or you drop half a dollar in or a quarter or whatever to make a purchase? That seems to be so damned ugly, and it's on just about every residential corner, at least in this part of Chicago. I offer you that observation and looking for your response right after we pause for, speaking of commercialism, we're talking tonight about the look of Chicago, about buildings, old and new, and about places and about streets and urban design and in general what they are doing to our city, and should they, whoever they are, be commended or condemned. My guests are Blair Kamin, the architecture critic for the Chicago Tribune, whose book Why Architecture Matters was published about a year ago and has just now been reissued in paperback by the University of Chicago Press. And we're talking with Larry Booth and Dan Coffey, leading architects in town. Larry Booth is the founder of his own firm, Booth, Hanson Associates. Dan Coffey is the founder of his firm, which is Daniel P. Coffey and Associates. I raised a simple question, and I really wonder about this. In other cities in America, do you find 10 or 12 vending machines, each separate little machines, many of them kind of rusty and otherwise cranky?
It's very interesting.
And all selling publications or giving away free publications.
Well, it's very interesting because it's really a freedom of the press issue.
Well,
back in the early 90s, we redesigned the plan for the reopening of State Street. And at that time, we were trying to figure out where to put all these sidewalk things. And we were told by the Corporation Council and just about everyone else that you had to be very, very careful. And we designed some very nice containers for the newspapers, but no one can make them be in them. And the containers themselves have a kind of image for the newspaper or whoever is inside of it, because one newspaper is red, one is blue, one is green, and they don't want to give up that.
Well, let me
symbolism.
understand what the legal situation is. If I decide I'm going to start publishing Rosenberg's Roundup, a kind of a cheap gossip sheet, but I'm going to fund it myself, can I then go ahead and find somebody to design an ugly box to put on every corner in Chicago? And can the city not stop me from doing that?
They cannot. You could, if you pay for the box and put it out there, and you have a
public
purpose.
I'm going to disagree. I think that's okay. I think cities are messy. They have vitality. They should not be perfect. They should not be Martha Stewartized. You know, I think it's okay to have
a little ugliness is desirable. You're saying.
Yeah, I mean that's the real world. Come on. I mean,
Well,
you know.
I think it's easy to bash what's going on because we look back nostalgically perhaps at some of the pictures of Chicago and say, boy, it was better then, it was more humane then. But this is a great American city, and it's going to move and it's going to change, and there's this fear sometimes with neighborhood groups of things that are going to happen, and sometimes they're bad and sometimes they're good, and we've got to live with it. That's the nature of the American city. It's full of vitality.
You know, as Algren said, this is a hustler's town, and you know it's got that incredible energy, and you can't just tame it so it's boring. You don't want to overdo it.
I am fond of Mother Tribune. She treats me well, but I must say that I was really rather startled to see these globular things on top of a red vending box, and I wondered what they were. Only I saw them driving around only a few months ago for the first time, and I finally walked up to one and took a close look, and it was the vending machine for
Red Eye,
the tabloid put out by the Tribune, and I take that to be an additional eyesore.
I think there's a limit now. We're reaching a limit. Outside our office, there's literally 15 of these things side by side, which when you come up to the corner and you get out of a cab, you are confronted by this, and you can't get onto the curb.
Does it happen?
It's just terrible, Blair. It's
prissy little architect.
Yeah, right.
I was asking about other American cities. Do we have the same in?
Well, I mean, you know, in a place
comparable
like
cities.
Portland or Minneapolis, you know, those kind of Scandinavian cities where everything's perfect. You know, they don't do stuff like that. But I mean, you know, you go to New York, how many papers? You know, they got 4 daily papers in New York, all slugging it out. I mean,
but they have fewer boxes.
They're not on every street corner.
Come on. I mean,
well, I think it's good. We have a lot of vitality in the journalistic community, and I'm all for it.
I think that's. I don't think those. I mean, I think there's a limit to how much you want to control street furniture.
Okay,
I
back
don't think it's
to buildings, or at least structures. We can't call Soldier Field a building, but it sure is a structure, and it has offended, what they've done to it has offended everybody, has it not? Or is there anybody who's enthusiastic for it?
Well, the architects who designed it seem to be defending it.
Defending, but
and also I think there's a group of architects in Chicago who have defended it. Doug Garofalo, a young architect, has publicly defended it. There are other.
What's the nature of the defense?
The nature of the defense is that you can't just do a retro stadium like Camden Yards, that this is 2003, and that if you're going to build here, you got to do something that's of its time. And you got to do something modern. You got to do something that contrasts.
Why not tear the old one down and put up something modern?
That's a good question.
That was probably the more sensible thing, because keeping the colonnades, you really disfaced them the way it is now, and you might as well have torn them down and freed the site up and had a great new stadium, which was the state of the art and a benchmark for the world in terms of stadiums.
Yep.
And what we have now is something that's been constricted and contorted in order to fit into an improper kind of position.
But if you tore it down...
But on the other hand, as a preservationist, I look back at the moment when they had torn down the field house, the Park District office, and it cleared out back to the original Halliburton Roche design. That was absolutely sublime.
It was
extraordinary.
The open U. Soldier Field was originally designed as a U-shaped stadium that framed the colonnaded at the Field Museum.
And faced into the Field Museum. And that was as sublime as any complex of buildings in the world.
Of course,
we should have stopped right there.
Yeah.
What is the association, this is merely a quiz question, a trivia question, between that colonnade and a well-known actor, film actor, who originated in at Northwestern University as an actor and went on to a distinguished career?
Sounds like Charlton Heston.
It is Charlton Heston. How's he connected to Soldier Field? Do you know?
That I don't know.
Is this a quiz?
Did they film
Yeah,
a
it is a
chariot
quiz.
race there?
No.
Ben-Hur?
When
Yeah.
he was still a student at Northwestern in the drama school,
Yeah.
I guess, they did a film of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And they filmed most of it under those colonnade columns, which look quite Roman.
Absolutely.
Oh, we better find that and reissue it.
I've seen the film. I saw the film once in somebody's film society.
Huh, that's great.
30 or 40 years ago.
That's great.
And I mentioned it once to Heston, who speaks quite fondly of that. It was a student film effort, but
Well, they'd have a
quite
hard time
ambitious.
filming it under the current conditions.
Preservationists should
That's
have
the
brought him in to testify.
Yeah,
that's right.
That would have been it. Little word from Moses would have convinced the mayor to...
The whole Soldier Field issue is really one that's complicated and is a element that complicates most architecture in that it's a difficult program to be put into a difficult site. But separately from that, it was also a program mandated essentially by the financing for the project. If it hadn't been inside of an older building, I believe it would not have been able to be financed.
Why?
So just because of legal strictures with the financing monies and certain legislations and things like that, it's unfortunate. It dealt a very hard hand for any architect to have come up with that solution.
I was talking
Probably was the wrong idea.
I was talking to Harry Cobb, an architect from Boston, New York, who designed the Prudential Tower in Boston, and he said the architects don't create the politics, but their job is to ensure that the politics don't destroy the architecture.
I think that's very important. And I was going to say that it's important to get the architects involved early on and to envision what the politics mean before the politics get fixed into place, because it can make a big difference. And I think that's probably in the process of Soldier Field. It might have been improved if you could have understood more fully what the ramifications were, both financially and architecturally and planning-wise. I think we're going to have a traffic problem there because the access to this is limited, and you have thousands of cars that are going to come out all at once, and we'll wait and see how that works.
Yep.
It's part of the general tourist guide routine concerning Chicago. Often this line is reproduced in things that are written, that this is the architectural capital of the world. Is it still? In terms of what it has to show.
Well, I think that Chicago is certainly the most important architectural city in America. I don't think there's any doubt that given its history
Because of some of the old buildings that are still there.
Yeah, in other words, but I think, because of the invention of the skyscraper here, because of Frank Lloyd Wright's, incredibly revolutionary
But has the
analysis.
architectural work of the last 10 or 15 years added to that luster as the architectural capital of the country, or has it diminished?
Well, no, I don't think there's any question that recent architecture here has not exactly set the world on fire.
We haven't kept up.
But you know what?
pace.
No, I actually think that there are some encouraging signs in Chicago architecture. There are some young architects coming up who are doing some innovative things. People like Doug Garofalo or Jeannie Gang, and I think that we're in a new world and in a new time, and I think it's great that. People like Cindy Pritzker wrote a $15 million check to bring Frank Gehry here to really shake things up at the Millennium Park Band Shell. So I think that there are some hopeful signs here, and that even as we rip all these really bad buildings that are going up, there are some good ones that are going up, and there are some encouraging signs here.
Well, I'm sorry to be in such a truly curmudgeonly mood, but I raise this question again just as we dash away for some commercials, and I'd love to hear your response to it. What's really so great about the Frank Gehry band shell that will be going up, that is now going up, in what will ultimately be Millennium Park? I look forward to your answers after these words. And we return to Larry Booth, Dan Coffey, and Blair Kamin, all of them, to say the least, quite interested in and involved with the Chicago scene the physical scene, the buildings, the places. And speaking of places and structures, what really is so great about that new band shell designed by Gary?
Well,
You go ahead, Larry.
I'll defend it because I think two things.
I'm not attacking it. I'm just confused as to what its
I
significance
think the
is.
trellis, which really performed a great service in getting rid of a lot of poles that would have obstructed the views of the stage, is an incredible innovation and much in the Chicago tradition of a structural breakthrough in a way.
Now, this trellis, you got to explain to the listeners, is 600 feet long. It's as long as 2 football fields, and it's as wide as 1 football field. It's kind of like a dome of steel.
It's a very flat dome
Right.
of a lattice or a trellis
Right.
that works structurally. So it's innovative structurally.
And it rises over the audience, and then you're going to have speakers hung from it. So even if you're, 500 feet from the stage, at least in theory, these guys say, you're going to be able to hear as if you're sitting as well as...
Speakers and lighting.
Right.
And it's a wonderful innovation, and I think much in the Chicago tradition of a functional, innovative, poetic invention, if you will. Very inventive.
But I don't think there's any doubt that this is a confrontational, avant-garde building, and we haven't had a lot of buildings like that here lately.
I think that's what's important. We've been too adverse to risk.
Right, exactly. Too tame. And this is a building that, with its curling, wisps of steel, those Betty Boop eyelashes and steel, is really making a statement alongside those kind of bland corporate towers.
A statement has content. What is the content of the statement?
I don't think there's any doubt that the content of the statement is exuberance and festivity. And actually, it isn't altogether that different a statement than the statement that Buckingham Fountain makes. It's about celebratory. It's about celebrating the park and the joy of music and the joy of a concert and a performance. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's terrific.
I'm still a bit worried about it. It's too early to judge realistically what it's going to be. I am afraid that, although I applaud it as a groundbreaking, innovative kind of thing that breaks the norm from today's traditions of tradition, but at the same time, I think that it has potential to be huge problems. I mean, one of the reasons that you go to a Grant Park concert is to be outdoor. And when you're outdoors underneath a big trellis that's pretty substantial, I'm not sure you get that same experience again. We have to live with it for a while. I'm also not sure that the architecture, even by Frank Gehry, who I admire substantially, isn't at least a little bit derivative of so many of his other projects. And I believe that it may be not one of his best works. He's done
Is it the case that
spectacular work
the cost overrun doubles or triples the original estimate?
I think what happened on this timing thing was they started out with one project, and over the course of time, as that project got to be improved and elaborated and made much more exciting and added to, that it changed the whole program, and it's going to just take longer.
Well, I mean, essentially, they made up that park as they went along, and when you put a giant band shell like Geary's on top of essentially a steel and concrete structure, you have to have more foundation below to support it, so that helped drive up the cost a lot.
I think there's going to be a wonderful juxtaposition of Frank Gehry's billowing forms on the south side and Tom Beebe's very elegant and quite beautifully proportioned entry into the dance theater, and it'll be a wonderful combination of two kinds of points of view, which will be quite enlivening to the Chicago architectural theme.
What happens to old buildings or older buildings when the institution they are in housed moves away? I read your piece, Blair, about the Museum of Contemporary Art, that is its current location. And just tonight, I was walking down Ontario, going to a restaurant to meet some friends, and I passed the old Museum of Contemporary Art, which is still there, and it stands empty. It's been empty, for 5 years or so?
Yeah, it looks better than the Museum of Contemporary Art that we have.
But why isn't that building
No, actually, it's not
adapted
empty. I just actually
Yeah,
designed
Larry's
it
building.
in 1979.
I like that building.
Yeah.
That was your whole building.
That's right. It was a strange juxtaposition of putting together a 4-story townhouse and a 1-story bakery to try to make a museum out of it. But it's not empty now. There is a studio, a TV studio, a film studio company in there that has used the entire facility. So
Is that
it's
a fact?
still it's still
Well, they don't
being
have any
used.
sign there indicating that they're inside. I
Well,
guess.
they have a very quiet sign.
But the big issue now with regard to institutions that need to get reused is Cook
Yeah.
County Hospital. That's
Yes,
that's
I
the
know,
big one
I
that
know.
people are talking about and is before the county board.
The county board wants to tear it down, apparently.
Well, John Stroger has indicated that he wants to tear it down. But a week ago, Stroger and the board voted unanimously to hold a public hearing to determine whether to ask developers whether this building could actually be reused. And this is a very significant case because this is a building that's out in the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
It's not downtown. You know, it's not a loop building. But some people have called it Chicago's Statue of Liberty.
Well, Dan
because-
Coffey has done a great deal to refit buildings for other uses. You've done that most recently for Medina Temple, isn't that right?
Right. We put the new Bloomingdale's home
Yeah.
store.
And
in.
before that,
One of the I like quite a bit is the DePaul Center, which was the old Goldblatt department
Mhm.
store, converted to offices in DePaul's home.
I would therefore have to assume that you would favor the retention of the Cook County Hospital and its adaptation to some other use.
I would completely, but one of the things that started both the Medina Temple project and the DePaul Center project was the question of how can we save it. And in both cases, I said very simplistically, you must find something to use it. And then that can drive how to adapt it, make it more useful for the future. In some cases, totally change it. Actually, in both those cases, totally change it.
Well, I don't suppose it would make sense to turn Cook County Hospital into high-priced condominium apartments.
Well, actually, the Landmarks Preservation Council of Illinois has proposed almost exactly that.
Really?
Yeah, and I don't know if that's the solution. I think that the key thing is to hear, as Dan says, from developers who can propose new uses for the buildings. And that we have heard from some who say they want to turn into medical office building, which is needed out there.
What is the history of that building?
The building is it's essentially a cousin of City Hall. I mean, you know, it was built right around the same time as City Hall. It turns a hospital for the poor into a kind of a people's palace. It's like a monument, you know, with these huge classical columns and these beautiful swags and other Beaux-Arts decoration. And I think it obviously fell on very hard times, and became a kind of Dickensian place with wards
It
and
was sort of a
things like
bleak
that.
house, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And yet, I mean, I think it's in a strange way, it's beloved by people who've been through it. Doctors from all around the country are clamoring to save it. And I think it's really a test in many ways of whether Chicago can extend some of the preservation victories that it's had downtown, saving the Reliance Building, the Cultural Center, the Marquette, other important buildings like that, whether we can now turn that same attention out to the neighborhoods and save important buildings out there.
You know, my mind suddenly turns to the competition between the great medical centers of Chicago. And it's in some part an architectural competition. I think particularly of the two big outpatient buildings put up in recent years, one by the University of Chicago Medical Center and two by Northwestern.
Yeah.
And they try to outdo one another in opulence, I think.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've all seen those two places.
Yeah.
How do you like them?
Well, I was actually on the committee for Northwestern, and I was somewhat responsible for making the lobby a little more opulent than the original idea, because they had a normal ceiling height in there, and I made the observation that people coming to the hospital usually are under some duress, and it's not a good time in their lives. And to lift that up and make that a little more of an uplifting experience and giving them some sense of quality, as opposed to many hospitals are just so dreary and so utilitarian and so devoid of human spirit. So you may call it opulence, but I think it's important that those institutions, like the original Cook County Hospital building, which is quite an opulent building, with the one that we're talking about saving. So I would defend the opulence, if you will, and say that it's a humanism.
Well, it's about spirit. It's about people's spirit.
It's about how quality of experience.
I can quite agree with you because, in fact, about 2 years ago, I got myself a new set of knees, and at the University of Chicago Medical Center. But then I needed to get the exercise retraining and so on. And I went to the Health South place. They've since gone bankrupt or accused of terrible things. But they have a nice installation in that building. And yes, I was somewhat elevated by the elevated ceiling and by the rather baronial lobby the first time I went in there. It's a perfectly nice human experience. What about...
And actually, it didn't cost... It cost very, very little to...
What about the other one? What about University of Chicago? The Duchy Swa Center, I believe it's called. Have you seen it?
I've seen it. I think it's not a particularly adventurous building on the outside like the Northwestern building. It's kind of it makes an attempt to fit in with a collegiate Gothic style, doing it in concrete. It's a decent building. It may be a little bit better than the U of C building, which is kind of somewhat hulking, despite its better than the Northwestern building. Somewhat, I think the Northwestern buildings, the proportions though, they're kind of chunky.
It has a nice interior space.
Yeah.
With balconies around a sort of a central court.
Yeah. They're still pretty chunky towers. So I think though they're both basically
they're good background.
Well, they're
buildings.
attempting to humanize the hospital experience with this incredible program demand of the hospital type building.
Yep.
One recent building, we were talking about this before we started tonight. It startled me when I drove by it just the other day and saw for the first time what looked like an apple cut out of a wall. And I wondered, what in the world is that? It occurred to me, it must be Apple computers. But I didn't know it until I read your article.
Yeah, it is indeed. It's the new Apple store on Michigan Avenue, just north of Nike Town. And, I mean, if this is a temple of technology, a cathedral of computing. I will admit, though, Milt, that when I first saw that Apple II, I wanted to gag. I mean, I looked at I thought immediately of, the building we all love to hate, the Disney store with 170 Mickey Mouse ears plastered on the facade. The thing is, though, that this...
You hate that as much as you hate the whatchamacallit cafe out of...
Oh, the
Rainforest Cafe.
Rainforest Cafe.
No, they're kind of they're both in there. I mean, they both have their really
they run a close tie.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But the Apple Store is pretty good, and I think it's actually a welcome addition to Michigan Avenue. The exterior of that building is pretty quiet, nicely done in limestone. The interior is just beautiful. It has a nearly all glass staircase that's just spectacular. A great atrium in there, and if you want to see the latest in technology, it's the place to go.
Do they sell stuff in there, or is it like...
Yes, they do.
The Sony place doesn't really sell you anything.
They do, though. No, they do. They do sell you
now.
stuff. Yeah, they do. They do.
At first, they didn't.
But the whole idea of these places is they're museum-like, and you feel like
that's my point about the Sony.
I mean, and you feel like you're privileged, to buy that, iMac that costs $3,000 or something, and they seduce you.
I think
they do it really well.
In many ways, these retails have out-museumed museums now.
Right.
The museum community is going to have to re-examine what they're doing because the retail community has really outstripped them. I mean, I think the number of stores that have gone up on Michigan Avenue have spent more money and it brought more design talent to their installations.
Well, many of them aren't especially retail establishments as much as they are branding opportunities for the companies that are doing them.
Dan Coffey, if you were called upon to write a chapter in somebody's book explaining the transformation of Michigan Avenue, particularly, over the last 20 years, what theme would you develop?
Well, it's a very complex theme because it's a mixture of the story of zoning and the story of the attitude of retailers to all want to be exactly in the same place, and also the transformation of the city of Chicago from State Street being the retail corridor to another location. And a lot of demographic things moved things to Michigan Avenue. The lack of restrictions in height and other things caused the verticality that's now there. Unfortunately, I think that the biggest issue is that for the most part, the designers that have worked on Michigan Avenue have not had the greatest sense of quality or the greatest sense of talent. There's bad proportions, bad materials, and clumsy buildings.
And they tore down some rather attractive older buildings to put these up.
Right. And the best example, perhaps, of that is the Marriott Hotel building with the Diana Court and the Art Nouveau or Art Deco buildings that were on that location at that time. And then it spread from there. And
of course,
may not have gotten worse, but didn't get better.
Recently, they redid. They did some new work a year or two ago on the Marriott Hotel, and they reconstituted whatever the facade was for the building directly to its north, and they put in Nordstroms. I don't know of any more discomforting space in this town than the lobby once you enter that Nordstrom building and go up that marble incline to whatever abattoir you will find at the end. That's really a very unsettling space.
I think in some ways...
You agree with me?
Michigan Avenue at one time, even in my lifetime, was a very elegant street.
Yeah.
And it's become glitzified. And in terms of the sort of aggressive retailing, not like the Apple store, which is much restrained, even though the logo you can criticize, but it's a restrained, elegant kind of look, and it has a quality look to it.
I'm seeking verification, or I'm seeking some reinforcement. How do you feel when you enter that Nordstrom building from the Michigan Avenue side?
I think it's compromised and clumsy. And what does that mean? It probably wanted to be bigger initially than originally. It's compromised by the relatively poor redoing of the Marriott building and a well-done reconstruction of the, what's the name of that building? McGraw-Hill building. But it's a well-done reconstruction, and somehow that space in between is just uncertain.
But I think the broader issue here is something that's really fascinating. I mean, for years, planners have said we want a 24-hour downtown. We want all these activities, retail, residential, restaurants, all these things. And now we're getting it, right? I mean, as clumsy as the architecture on Michigan Avenue is, that street is packed with people. It is hopping out there. It is a really vibrant urban scene. You know, as long as you keep your eyes down and don't look at the buildings
or the people.
Well, that's another issue. But I think what's fascinating here is that we're achieving our dream in terms of urbanism. You know, making the city a vital place, but at the same time, we're not building it with the same quality that you associate with the old Michigan.
Well, I could ask. Indeed, I will assign to Larry Booth for after we return another chapter on a book about the architectural transformation of Chicago. A chapter not about Michigan Avenue, but about the Ontario Street corridor and what's happened to it over the last 10 or 15 years, and why did it happen? These misfortunes have to be explained, and I shall look for that explanation right after we pause for these words. And it is time to invite telephone calls and email for any question you want to raise, talking with two of Chicago's leading architects and surely its leading architectural journalist. Blair Kamin, the latter, Larry Booth and Dan Coffey, the former. The number 591-7200, 591-7200, 312 if you're calling long distance. And if you're listening to us on the internet at a very long distance and would rather communicate via email, the email address is extension 720 at tribune.com. Somebody who lives in Sydney, Australia and wants to tell us about the wonderful Opera House can give us an email. It's about noon in Sydney at the moment, and we know we've got some listeners down there. By all means, let us hear from you at extension 720 at tribune.com, or for phone calls 591-7200. Shortly on to the phones, but I was inviting you, Larry, to talk about the Ontario corridor. I suppose I should add Ohio, or the Ohio corridor as well.
Yeah, I see those as the Ohio-Ontario corridor, which is really the entry to the city from the Kennedy, as we all know. And if you look at that, the city is kind of dressed up as you come off the Kennedy. They put some landscaping in. They moved a sculpture from State Street, and they kind of presented a little better face. After that, it's 7 blocks or 8 blocks of dreck into the city. And I think it's, Dan Burnham said, make little plans. And urban renewal and mass clearance got a bad name in the 50s, but this was an opportunity of really opening up and making a statement of urban proportions.
Ohio is just undistinguished in various ways. Ontario has been turned into Coney Island.
Absolutely, and that if you look back and say there's a missed opportunity, we might have, at the time when that land was not worth much, we could have cleared that, made that a parkway, opened that up, developed more opportunities for development. And I think what we've learned, we're learning how to build an American city, and it's going to take us a while to do this. But to me, that was a great opportunity. When they built the expressway, they should have included that whole urban design component. And so that it really would integrate the entry into the city in a way that was more appropriate.
A former partner of yours, you can mention his name if you choose, designed the Hard Rock Cafe and put that great big guitar up into the air on Ontario. Isn't that right?
Oh, yes, right. That's my old and good friend Stanley Tigerman.
I believe so.
But I think that's that was well after the opportunity passed to really do a great entry into the city in a Burnham-like quality. You might defend that it's turned into a honky-tonk area, and it's like what we ask for. We get a dynamic zone of the city with a particular character.
Because I had somebody here recently who's done a book about how Chicago has transformed itself. A guy named Von Hoffman from Harvard. I don't know if you've seen that book. He's Nick Von Hoffman's son. And he argues that the city made a basic decision and a basic choice that it was going to turn itself into an entertainment center because it was losing a good deal of business, a good deal of corporate life.
Yeah, I think
and manufacturing.
Well, like all cities around the world have started to transform themselves and their cityscapes into places for tourists, and this creates some very strange buildings. I mean, before we had that wonderful Green Frog at the Rainforest Cafe, we had, Capone Chicago, this little theme attraction where, as Mary Schmeek, my colleague, so wonderfully put it, Al Capone, the cold-blooded killer, was turned into your sweet chipmunk-cheeked Uncle Al, all for the benefit of the tourists. So I think that there's no question that cities cartoonize themselves.
Seriously, those tourists are not all of them tourists from distant locations. They are Chicago suburbanites, who flock in here in their loose-fitting, undistinguished cotton raiments with their kind of fat kids dragged along behind them.
Are you a fashion critic?
I'm the oldest man at this table, and I'm
more
in the passing of civility, decency, and urban attractiveness.
Well,
and I was raised in New York
City. That part of the city, that's the honky-tonk area, and I think
was it 20 years ago?
This is a big. Like we said earlier, this is a big American city, and it should have many, many zones. It should have many, many characters, and some are going to attract you, and some are going to repel you, and you take your choice. And that's the great thing about the city that has developed in my lifetime. It went from a city with few choices to a city with many choices, and I think that we should all be proud of, and we should celebrate and feel good about.
And all those tourists pay taxes.
It's unquestionably one of the most livable, exciting cities in the whole country, and one of the major cities in the world.
It is vibrant. I mean, if you go to St. Louis, or if you go to Milwaukee, or God help us, Detroit, those places just look with envy at Chicago. They really do. And I mean, I think what's so fascinating.
Are you guys all natives?
I am.
Of the Chicago area?
Yeah, I am. Jersey.
Blair's from Jersey, Because, I was born and raised in New York with some time in Paris, and then I came to Chicago.
Yeah.
And
but Chicago is Chicago is the great American exaggeration, as Perry Dewis once put it. It gives you the best and the worst in just the most of everything,
feet of each other,
with exclamation points, and exactly within feet of each other. And so even as we're talking about the uglification of the Ohio-Ontario corridor, you have the beautification going on with flowers that people ooh and ah about, and they're all there for the tourists. I mean, why are those little flower boxes there that everybody likes on Michigan Avenue? It's to make it look nice.
I think it's fabulous. The variety and the contrast between the landscaping program that the mayor has been so passionate about has really paid off in spades. I think people come to Chicago from other parts. Friends of ours come who have never been here. They are simply blown away.
You know, speaking of the mayor, this is just an easy free association. One really can't talk about the changing face of Chicago without talking about all the residential building that's going on in, what do we call it, the South Loop or...
the South Loop or Central Station,
Central
the
Station
area just to the west of...
There's a vast amount going on over there.
There is, and not much of it is good.
But the seeds of that go back to the 60s when all the major movers and shakers in this city, all corporate heads, said this city could turn into, as Blair mentioned, Detroit. It could become a non-downtown, and it was slowly being eaten away at almost like a cancer from the south side with the transference away from the railroad economy to other economies. And they said, we need to do something. And they actually bought a big hunk of property, created Dearborn Park as a limited dividend corporation. Quite a few corporations made their money back. They didn't make a lot of money, but that little seed, that little island that started up there and really opened up about 1980, allowed everything else to happen around it. It was a major, major corporate intervention by civic leadership that we need more of.
We moved our office to Printers Row in 1980, and at the time that strip between Polk Street and Congress on Dearborn was absolutely empty. It was vacant. We were literally the only new thing that had happened there in 50 years. And over the course of the next 20 years, we just watched it transform itself into a vibrant community. Even with Starbucks.
Well, Starbucks is everywhere, on every corner.
They're even there.
What do you make of those buildings that I see? I haven't been very close to them. As I drive down on the outer drive, as I go down to Hyde Park to the university or drive back from there, they are obviously residential buildings, and they're sort of rectangular, and 3 or 4 of them have popped up in just the last year.
Yeah, I don't think they're so great, and in fact,
I didn't say they were. I just wondered what you think.
Yeah, some of these buildings actually ape the classical style of the museums, like the Field Museum, and one of them has a little belvedere, a little tower on top that's really poorly proportioned. It looks like a bad city hall somewhere in, I don't know, Iowa or something like that, or a bad county courthouse. They're weak. These are really weak buildings, and I mean, if you think about the elegance of the towers on North Lakeshore Drive, and what's there on South Lakeshore Drive, it's a far, far cry from what we had, just north of Oak Street.
Well, my basic criticism of architecture and architects right now is that so much of architecture actually comes from the sense of proportion, scale, sizes of things, and the interaction of materials, that too many architects right now are just looking for their big headline, a big bold statement that says, look at me, and then 5 minutes later it's essentially forgotten. And I think that we need to remember to build more for the future and for the long term, and that comes from those things. There are fundamental rules about beauty that we can stretch and make special, but that's lacking right now.
A directive for architects was given by, of all people, William Shakespeare. Did you know that? From Henry IV, Part 2. I quote, "When we mean to build, we first survey the plot, then draw the model. And when we see the figure of the house, then we must rate the cost of the erection, which, if we find outweighs ability, what do we then but draw anew the model in fewer offices, or at least desist to build at all." If you can't do it well with the money that you've got available, then what you really should do is nothing.
Well, I think that's the challenge
Shakespeare
to the architects, and at times it has been met. Like Mies van der Rohe did some marvelous architecture that was very cost effective. In fact, it was done much like the concrete buildings of today. It was done by a developer for profit, to make money, and Mies found a way to do great architecture. And I think that's the challenge to architects today.
You were saying, before we went on the air, I think, that those black steel buildings on Lakeshore Drive,
right,
famous Mies buildings, are were sort of cheap to erect.
Exactly. At the time, they were as inexpensive a building as could be built because they were built for profit and they were built for a development that had a bank loan and had all the pressures of commercialism, if you will. But Mies made art out of them and was supported by Herb Greenwald, who was a master developer.
I think that was the key, was he was supported by that developer who insisted upon an innovative building by a very talented architect, and that's an important part of the puzzle. You can't build, which is really what you were saying in quoting Shakespeare, is you can't force a good building out of something that can't become good.
Is it the case then that the fault is not in our stars but in our developers?
Or you might say that good architecture is impossible without good clients.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. The client is very important because, after all, they're much part of the team as the architect is, and there are a lot of ingredients that they bring to it that are very important.
Is there any developer in town that you have something good to say about?
Well, the developers who did Skybridge, Bill Moran and Howard Weiner, certainly, as Larry said earlier, deserve some credit.
And a developer I worked for, Bill Smith, who built those buildings, Erie on the Park.
Yeah, Lucien Lagrange's buildings. These are the buildings that have like a V-shaped truss on the outside. They're painted white. They're over near the railroad tracks on the western end of Erie Street, just along
And both
the
these are
River.
risk-taking projects where the developer really went out of his way to put himself in harm's way, in a way.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
We are going to pause and take care of some of our clients, and then we will be going directly to the phones. There are a few lines available. Now's the time to get your calls in if you want to be heard, to pose a question or to offer a thought, or perhaps even a curmudgeonly view like those expressed by the host of this program. The phone number, 591-7200.